You think you've done shadow work because you journaled about your childhood trauma or cried during therapy. But here's the truth. Most people who claim they're integrating their shadow are actually just reinforcing their ego with spiritual language. They're collecting psychological concepts like trophies, displaying them on social media, using them in conversations to sound evolved. But real shadow work has nothing to do with sounding enlightened or feeling peaceful. It has a signature that Carl Jung identified decades ago, and it's so disturbing, so psychologically destabilizing, that most people run from it the instant they catch a glimpse of what it actually requires. Real shadow work doesn't look like peace to the outside world. It doesn't look like someone who has it all figured out. To the unawakened eye, it looks like danger. It looks like someone who has crossed a line that society tells us never to cross. It looks like someone who has stopped playing the game everyone else is still desperately clinging to. So how do you actually know if someone has done the real work? How do you distinguish between someone who has genuinely integrated their darkness and someone who is just performing spirituality, who is using Jung's language as another mask to hide behind? That's exactly what we're about to uncover. The signs are specific, they're measurable in psychological terms, and once you understand them, you'll never confuse fake shadow work with the real thing again. You'll see through the performance immediately. Let me start by destroying the most common misconception about what shadow work actually is. It's not reading Carl Jung quotes on Instagram and nodding along while you sip your coffee. It's not talking about your inner child in therapy sessions where you feel safe and validated. It's not posting vulnerability essays on social media about your healing journey while simultaneously blaming your parents, your ex, your boss, or society for every problem in your life. That's not shadow work. That's spiritual bypassing, and it has become an epidemic. Spiritual bypassing is when people use the language of transformation to avoid the actual process of transformation. They weaponize therapy speak to justify staying exactly where they are. They turn their trauma into an identity, collect their wounds like merit badges, and call it self-awareness. But self-awareness without change is just self-obsession with better vocabulary. Jung was brutally clear about this distinction. The shadow isn't something you talk about at dinner parties. It's not something you analyze from a safe distance. It's something you confront in the darkness of your own psyche. And that confrontation doesn't just change how you think. It changes who you are at a fundamental level that most people aren't psychologically prepared to handle. Here's the first real sign of someone who has truly integrated their shadow, and this one alone will separate the pretenders from the integrated immediately. They have experienced the complete death of moral superiority. Let me explain what this means and why it's so significant. You know that feeling you get when you witness someone being selfish and you think to yourself, I would never do that. Or when you see someone lie, cheat, manipulate, and you feel a sense of being fundamentally different from them, fundamentally better than them. That feeling isn't virtue. That's your ego defending itself. That's your psyche's primary defense mechanism working overtime to keep your shadow projected outward onto other people so you never have to look at it inside yourself. It's psychological sleight of hand, and everyone does it unconsciously. But when someone does real shadow work, that entire mechanism collapses. It doesn't gradually fade, it shatters in a moment of horrifying recognition. They stop being able to judge other people because they've seen the exact same capacity for evil, for cruelty, for selfishness, for manipulation inside themselves, not as a theoretical concept they read about in a book, but as a living reality they've had to face in their own psyche. Consider a case profile based on observed psychological patterns. Picture someone who spent years, maybe decades, judging people for being dishonest. They prided themselves on being the honest one in every relationship, the person who always told the truth no matter what, the person with integrity while everyone else compromised theirs. This became part of their identity, part of how they understood themselves as separate from and superior to others. Then one day, during deep psychological excavation, they stumble into a realization that makes them physically nauseous. They've been lying to themselves about everything that actually matters for their entire life. They lied about their true motivations for their career choices. They lied about what they actually wanted from their relationships. They lied about their fears, their desires, their resentments. Every single act of judgment toward liars was just a projection, a way of exiling the liar inside themselves into other people so they could maintain the false image of being truthful. This realization doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't make them feel spiritual or evolved. It makes them feel disgusted with themselves, because now they understand at a visceral level that they are no different from the people they spent years judging, and they can never go back to that comfortable position of moral superiority again. This is what Jung meant when he said that the shadow contains everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. Everything we've decided is unacceptable. Everything we've amputated from our conscious identity and buried in the unconscious. The integrated person doesn't become more moral in the traditional sense. They don't become a better person by society's standards. They become more honest, more whole, more real. They recognize that every single human behavior, every act they've witnessed and judged in others, empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Exists as a potential inside them, and that recognition completely kills the ego's favorite drug, which is the feeling of being superior to other people. Comment: I see myself if you've ever had a moment like this, where your own shadow became undeniable. The second sign is even more psychologically unsettling, and it's the one that makes integrated people feel dangerous to be around. The integration of aggression. Society has spent centuries teaching us that nice people are good people, that real kindness means never saying no, never establishing boundaries, never standing up for yourself, never showing your teeth. We've been conditioned to believe that aggression in any form is toxic, that anger is something to be ashamed of, that conflict should be avoided at all costs. But Jung understood something that most people completely miss in their rush to be perceived as good. Niceness is often just cowardice that has learned to disguise itself as virtue. It's the shadow's way of staying hidden while still controlling your behavior. Real integration doesn't make you a nicer person in the way society defines niceness. It makes you dangerous in a very specific way, and that danger is actually what makes you trustworthy. Let me clarify exactly what I mean by dangerous, because this is where most people misunderstand completely. A person who has integrated their aggression isn't violent. They're not cruel. They're not going around starting fights or destroying relationships for no reason. But they're boundaried in a way that most people aren't. They have full access to their complete range of power, including the power to end relationships, to walk away from situations that don't serve them, to say things that make other people deeply uncomfortable, to stand their ground when everyone else is pressuring them to back down. They're no longer afraid of conflict because they've made peace with the part of themselves that is fully capable of fighting, of destroying, of saying the word no and meaning it with every fiber of their being. And this quality makes people nervous, because most of us are surrounded by people who avoid conflict like it's a disease, who smile when they're seething with rage underneath, who say yes when they desperately want to say no, who let themselves be walked over repeatedly because they're terrified of what might happen if they actually stood up for themselves. When you encounter someone who has integrated their shadow, You feel it in your body immediately. They're kind. They might even be generous and compassionate, but you sense something underneath the surface. A line you instinctively know not to cross. A capacity for destruction that they've chosen not to use, but could access in an instant if necessary. We see this dynamic clearly in the narrative of a professional who spent decades being the peacemaker in every workplace environment, always agreeing with the boss, even when the boss was wrong, always compromising on their own needs to make other people comfortable, always putting themselves last and calling it teamwork. They genuinely believed this pattern made them a good person, a valuable employee, someone worthy of respect. Then they began serious shadow work and discovered something that challenged their entire self-concept. They weren't being kind or collaborative. They were being passive, conflict avoidant, psychologically weak. They were dodging confrontation because they were absolutely terrified of their own anger, of their own capacity for aggression. So they started the painful process of integrating that anger. Not by becoming an aggressive person, not by starting to treat people poorly, but by allowing themselves to actually feel the rage they'd been repressing for years, to explore it without judgment, to understand where it came from, and most importantly, to give themselves permission to use it when the situation genuinely called for it. And their entire social reality shifted almost overnight. People stopped taking advantage of them at work. Colleagues started respecting their boundaries without them having to explain or justify those boundaries. Negotiations went differently because people could sense they were willing to walk away. But something else happened too. Some people stopped liking them. Some relationships ended because they were no longer willing to be the easy, agreeable, endlessly flexible person that certain people had grown dependent on manipulating. This is the cost of integration that nobody talks about in the self-help books. You stop being everyone's favorite person because you stop performing the carefully constructed version of yourself that exists purely to keep other people comfortable. You stop sacrificing your truth to maintain false harmony. And Jung would say, that's exactly the point. That's exactly what has to happen. The goal of shadow work has never been to make you more likable. The goal is to make you whole, even if wholeness means losing people who only loved the incomplete version of you. The third sign is the loss of projection, and this one separates people who are doing real psychological work from people who are just rearranging their neuroses into prettier patterns faster than anything else. Projection is the shadow's absolute favorite mechanism of self-preservation. It's the process where you take the parts of yourself you cannot accept, the qualities you've decided are too shameful or too threatening to acknowledge as yours, and you unconsciously see them in other people instead. You hate someone for being arrogant because you absolutely cannot face your own arrogance. You despise someone for being emotionally needy because you've completely repressed your own neediness. You feel disgusted by someone's selfishness because your own selfishness is too threatening to your self-image to acknowledge. The entire external world becomes a mirror reflecting your disowned parts back to you, but you don't realize you're just looking at yourself everywhere you go. When someone truly integrates their shadow, projection stops functioning the way it used to. It's not that they never project again, but they catch it happening much faster, and they can't sustain it anymore. They can't blame their romantic partner for their unhappiness because they've taken full ownership of their own role in creating and maintaining that unhappiness. They can't blame their boss for holding them back professionally because they've recognized and admitted their own patterns of self-sabotage. They can't blame their parents, society, the economy, their childhood, or their circumstances because they've taken complete psychological responsibility for their internal state, regardless of external conditions. This doesn't mean external factors don't matter. It doesn't mean that injustice doesn't exist, or that other people's actions don't have real consequences. It means they've stopped using those external factors as an excuse to avoid looking at their own darkness. their own contribution to their suffering, their own shadow material. A composite example, based on commonly observed clinical patterns, illustrates this shift clearly. Imagine someone trapped in a romantic relationship, where they constantly complain that their partner is emotionally unavailable. They've constructed an entire narrative around how their partner is fundamentally the problem, how their partner won't open up, won't be vulnerable, won't meet their emotional needs. If only their partner would change, if only their partner would do the work, everything would finally be okay. This story becomes their reality, the lens through which they interpret every interaction. Then they commit to real shadow work, and they uncover something absolutely devastating to their self-concept. They are the one who's actually emotionally unavailable. They've been so hyper-focused on their partner's emotional limitations that they never had to examine their own terror of genuine intimacy, their own patterns of emotional withdrawal disguised as criticism of the other person. Once they see this projection clearly, once it becomes undeniable, they can't keep doing it. They have to own it. They have to take it back and recognize it as their own material. And that ownership is psychologically excruciating because it means they can't be the victim of the relationship anymore. They have to be responsible. This is precisely why most people will never do real shadow work. Being the victim is psychologically easier than being responsible. Blame is comfortable and familiar. Ownership is brutal and destabilizing. But Jung was completely adamant about this principle. Until you stop projecting your darkness onto the external world, until you reclaim every single piece of yourself you've exiled into other people, you will never be psychologically free. You'll just keep recreating the exact same patterns, the exact same conflicts, the exact same forms of suffering in different contexts with different people, and you'll keep genuinely believing it's everyone else's fault. Here's the fourth sign, and this is the one that creates the most social friction for integrated people: the uncanny presence. Have you ever met someone who just felt fundamentally different from everyone else? Not different in a charismatic way where you're drawn to their charm. Not different in a warm and fuzzy way where you feel immediately comfortable, but different in a way that made you feel psychologically exposed, like they could see through every defense mechanism you had, like they could perceive the parts of you that you work very hard to keep hidden. That's what happens when someone successfully integrates their shadow. They become a walking mirror, and most people absolutely hate looking into mirrors that reflect their psychological reality back at them. Jung called this phenomenon psychological resonance. When you're internally divided against yourself, when your shadow material is hidden and unacknowledged, locked away in your unconscious, you operate through what he called the persona. You perform a carefully constructed version of yourself that's socially acceptable, professionally appropriate, emotionally palatable, psychologically safe for other people to be around. But when someone integrates their shadow, when they reclaim all the parts they've been performing away, that persona dissolves. They stop performing almost entirely. They just exist as they actually are. And that raw authenticity is deeply unnerving to people who are still performing, still hiding, still maintaining their masks. This creates what I call the mirror effect. Integrated people reflect back to you all the ways you're still divided, all the ways you're still hiding from yourself, all the ways you're still performing a false version of yourself to gain approval or avoid rejection. And that reflection is intensely uncomfortable. It forces people to confront their own shadow material just by being in the presence of someone who has already confronted theirs. This is why integrated people often report feeling profoundly lonely, even when they're surrounded by others. Not because they're incapable of connection, not because they don't want relationships, but because most people simply cannot tolerate being around them for extended periods. The mirror effect becomes too intense. It brings up too much psychological material that people aren't ready to process. So they avoid the integrated person, or they label them as weird, intense, too much, too deep, too serious. But what they're actually saying underneath all those labels is this: you make me feel things about myself that I've spent my entire life trying not to feel. You remind me of the work I'm avoiding. Consider the story of someone who dedicated years to intensive psychological integration work. They emerged from that process fundamentally changed, not necessarily happier in any conventional sense, not more successful by external measures, but undeniably more real, more solid, more integrated. And they began noticing a strange pattern in their social world. Old friends who had been close for years started gradually drifting away without any obvious conflict or falling out. Family members seemed increasingly uncomfortable during visits, couldn't quite articulate why, but started limiting contact. Meanwhile, new people entering their life showed extreme polarization. They were either immediately and deeply drawn to this person's authenticity, or they were instantly repelled and wanted nothing to do with them. There was almost no middle ground anymore, because integration creates natural polarity in relationships. You either resonate with someone's authenticity at a deep level, or you resist it because it threatens your own defense mechanisms. And that resistance is just another way the shadow protects itself from being seen. Comment "I feel this" if you've experienced this kind of social shift after doing serious inner work. Now we need to address why society as a collective organism actively hates real shadow work. Because this is the dimension of the process that nobody wants to acknowledge openly. Our entire social structure, every institution we've built, every unspoken rule we follow, is constructed on a foundation of collective repression. We all agree, mostly unconsciously, to hide our darkness from each other, to smile when we're filled with rage, to pretend we're fine when we're psychologically disintegrating, to maintain pleasant surfaces while chaos churns underneath. This mass agreement to repress keeps the social machinery running smoothly. It keeps interactions predictable. It keeps us polite, functional, safe from each other's unprocessed shadows. But when someone does real shadow work, when they actually integrate their darkness, instead of just managing it better, they break that collective agreement. They stop pretending. They stop playing along with the social game of niceness and superficiality that everyone else is still desperately invested in maintaining. And this is genuinely threatening to everyone who remains committed to the game. Because if one person can stop pretending and survive it, if one person can integrate their shadow and become more powerful rather than being destroyed by it, then that means everyone else could potentially do the same. And that possibility is terrifying to the collective psyche. It would mean the end of polite society as we currently know it. It would mean actual honesty replacing performed niceness, actual authenticity replacing carefully managed images, actual connection replacing the safe distance we maintain through our personas. And most people, and by extension most societies, are absolutely not ready for that level of psychological vulnerability and truth. This is why integrated people are so often marginalized by their communities, dismissed as too intense, or even pathologized as having something wrong with them. Society needs everyone to keep their shadow hidden and projected, because if we all started integrating simultaneously, the entire social system would collapse. Not violently, not dramatically, but it would fundamentally transform in ways that would make our current social structures unrecognizable. We would have to stop lying to each other constantly. We would have to stop performing acceptable versions of ourselves. We would have to actually deal with our darkness directly instead of projecting it onto convenient scapegoats. And that represents a level of collective psychological maturity that most societies throughout human history have never even approached. Jung understood this dynamic deeply. He knew that individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, wasn't merely a personal development journey. It was a revolutionary act with social and even political implications, because every single person who successfully integrates their shadow is one less person participating in the collective delusion, one less person available to be manipulated through their unacknowledged darkness. And enough integrated individuals could theoretically shift the entire consciousness of humanity towards something we can barely imagine from our current level of collective development. Now we've reached the climax of this exploration. What actually happens at the moment of total integration? When someone fully integrates their shadow, do they achieve enlightenment? Do they transcend all suffering? Do they become perfect? Not even close. They become what Jung described as psychologically invincible. And you need to understand precisely what that means and what it doesn't mean. Psychological invincibility isn't about never feeling pain, fear, anger, or any other difficult emotion. It's not about becoming so spiritually advanced that nothing bothers you anymore. It's about no longer being controlled by those emotions when they arise. It's about having complete access to your entire psyche, both light and dark dimensions, without being dominated or possessed by either side. When you successfully integrate your shadow, you stop being at war with fundamental parts of yourself. And when you're no longer engaged in constant internal warfare, external circumstances lose most of their power to destabilize you. Think carefully about how most people actually operate. Psychologically, they spend their entire lives running from their own darkness. They construct elaborate defense mechanisms. They project their fears and hatreds onto others. They numb themselves with endless distractions, substances, addictions, busy work, anything to avoid sitting alone with their own psyche. All of this avoidance requires absolutely enormous amounts of psychological energy. It's genuinely exhausting to keep your shadow repressed and managed and projected every single day of your life. But when you finally integrate it, when you reclaim those exiled parts and make peace with your own darkness, all that energy suddenly becomes available for other purposes. You're no longer fighting yourself. You're whole. And psychological wholeness is a form of power that most people never experience. A narrative illustration demonstrates this transformation clearly. Visualize someone who spent their entire life absolutely terrified of their own anger. They were taught from childhood that anger was unacceptable, that good people don't get angry, that expressing anger meant you were out of control and dangerous. So they repressed it completely, pushed it so far down into their unconscious that they genuinely believed they were just naturally calm and peaceful. But the anger didn't disappear. It couldn't disappear. It leaked out constantly in passive aggression, in chronic resentment, in subtle acts of self-sabotage that they couldn't understand or control. Their repressed anger was running their life from the shadows. Then they committed to shadow work and made the terrifying decision to actually feel that anger fully, to stop running from it, to explore it without judgment, to understand where it originated and what it was trying to protect. And something fundamental shifted in their psyche. The anger stopped controlling them because they were no longer afraid of it. They could access it consciously when a situation genuinely required that energy, and they could release it completely when it wasn't needed. They became integrated around their relationship to anger, and that integration made them psychologically stronger and more effective in ways they couldn't have predicted. They could set boundaries without guilt. They could say no without apologizing. They could stand their ground in conflicts without losing themselves. The very thing they'd spent decades running from became a source of power once they stopped rejecting it. This is what Jung meant by the ultimate goal of individuation. It has never been about becoming perfect by anyone's standards. It's about becoming complete. And completion necessarily includes your darkness, your aggression, your selfishness, your cruelty, your capacity for destruction, all of it. Because When you own all of those parts consciously, none of them can possess you unconsciously anymore. Let me bring this directly back to you, because that's what this exploration has always been about. The question isn't really whether someone else has done shadow work. The question is whether you're willing to do it. And here's the truth that most people don't want to hear directly. You probably haven't done it yet. You've probably read about shadow work. You've talked about it with friends or therapists. You've maybe done some surface-level journaling where you acknowledged having some flaws. But real shadow work requires you to face the parts of yourself you have spent your entire life trying to avoid, trying to kill, trying to exile into other people, so you never have to claim them as your own. The parts that are genuinely selfish, cruel, manipulative, cowardly, weak, pathetic. The parts that make you feel ashamed just admitting they exist inside you. And the real work doesn't happen in a comfortable seminar room or while reading an inspiring book or even in most therapy sessions. It happens in those moments when you're triggered intensely, when someone pushes your buttons and you feel that overwhelming surge of rage or terror or shame rising up. That's when your shadow is closest to the surface of consciousness. That's when you have the opportunity to turn around and look at it directly, to own it completely, to integrate it consciously. But most people run from those moments. They blame the other person for triggering them. They justify their reaction. They do absolutely anything to avoid seeing their own darkness reflected back at them. And that avoidance is precisely what keeps them stuck in the same patterns forever. Jung was absolutely clear about this fundamental principle. The shadow is not your enemy. It has never been your enemy. It's the disowned part of yourself, the amputated pieces of your psyche, and until you reclaim those parts, until you bring them back into conscious awareness and integration, you will never be whole. You'll just keep projecting your darkness onto others, keep running from it, keep being controlled by it from the shadows. But the moment you find the courage to turn around and face it, the moment you can say with total honesty, yes, that's me too, that's also part of who I am, everything in your psychological reality changes, because you're no longer divided against yourself, you're no longer at war with fundamental parts of your own nature. You're integrated. And integration is what real freedom actually feels like. The goal has never been to become a good person by society's standards. That's the ego's game, the persona's endless performance. The actual goal is to become whole, to have complete access to your entire range of human potential and experience without judgment, without repression, without fear of what you might find inside yourself. That's what real shadow work creates. Not a better person who follows all the rules, but a complete person who has reclaimed every exiled part. Not someone who never experiences anger or selfishness or fear, but someone who owns those dimensions of themselves completely and can use them consciously instead of being used by them unconsciously. So here's my final question for you. Are you actually willing to stop pretending? Are you willing to look directly at the parts of yourself you've been hiding for years or decades and say without flinching, that's me too? Are you willing to do the real work, not the Instagram aesthetic version, not the self-help book version that makes you feel good, but the genuinely terrifying, psychologically brutal, ultimately liberating work of integrating your shadow completely? Because once you make that choice authentically, once you truly commit to it, there's no going back to who you were before. You can't unsee your own darkness once you've looked at it directly, but you also can't be controlled by it anymore. And that's the entire point. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.